So we're doing it to ourselves.
All right. Well, welcome. Thanks for being back for session 2. It's great to be with you all again. The weeks go by fast, don't they?
Yeah.
They're just here. Would anybody like to start us in a word of prayer before we start? I'm very happy to. Let's all pray. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the chance to meet with one another today, and we ask for your continued guidance and wisdom as we contemplate chapters 2 and 3 of Laudato Si this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome. Those of you on Zoom, if at any point we cut out, we had, I think, a good recording last time, so I'm hoping that will continue, but feel free to get my attention, and would prefer, again, that you use the hand-raising feature. I can see all of you, and we'll happily call on you if you have anything you'd like to share. I wanted to begin, though, kind of the challenge last week was to pay attention to something, and not going to go around or anything, but if you're willing to share, or if there's anything that you gathered from that activity that you found especially helpful or interesting that you'd like to share, would really welcome a chance to hear from you now.
I can share. So since this whole pandemic started 2 years ago, my wife and I have been we stopped going to the local Y. So instead we're taking walks, and we take a daily walk about 45 minutes or so. We have a standard loop that we do through our neighborhood, and part of the loop takes us through basically woods that the township owns, and they put a paved path through it. And many of the times I just am walking and I'm looking down at the pavement and I'm thinking about other things. But this past week, I made a point of looking around, particularly at the trees, and noticing the bark on the trees. And even though there's no leaves, but the trees are interesting how different they all are in terms of the bark. And then looking at the debris, and just occasionally we've seen deer. We've seen actually a fox or two on our walk. So there is some wildlife too. So it just, to me, it just calls to mind, this is God's creation, and how wonderful it is and how beautiful it is, even in the midst of winter.
Thanks, Mark.
It just popped into my head because Code Blue's at Our Lady of Guadalupe this month. And when they built that, it was obvious that their planting was taking a different route than usual for a new building. If you go out, what is it, North Street, all the way out there.
Cold Spring Creamery.
Yeah, Cold Spring, okay, all the way to 413. The part along Cold Spring Creamery, if you look at what is growing there, it's all native plants. And they did that right from the beginning, which was what, 10, 12 years ago? But at any rate, that's unusual. There are places in town, like at the foot of the hill on Green Street coming down from the Mercer, where there's a wet garden. And it helps things absorb water. So instead of getting runoff and washing the soil and the plants and everything away, you get absorption and, intermingling and all this. But, and I remember helping plant one at the firehouse emergency house on East, almost to North Main Street, planting some things around there again to absorb water, and so it's something to notice. And the plants are so much happier. I mean, native plants, they're not struggling, they're not fighting with pests, they're meant to be where they are. So.
I don't know if this really fits into the theme directly, but just in terms of paying attention. So I serve on the board of a number of different not-for-profits, and for one of them, actually for many of them, but for this one, I also chair the strategic planning committee, and the big meeting on strategic planning was supposed to be this past Saturday, and so I've been preparing for it and, working with the CEO and all of this. And I was ready to lead the conversation in the meeting. And then, of course, most unfortunately, Sue Apollo, one of our joyful bell ringers and DPC members, passed away, and we decided we were going to ring for her service. So my first thought, of course, because I'm used to running and doing a million things, is okay, figure out which half hour we'll be ringing, and I'll do the meeting before, and then I'll step out and then do the meeting after. And I was getting ready to do all of that, and it just really struck me as wrong. And I just thought, and then of course we needed extra rehearsal time, so that always prompts you to change your plans. And then I was going to go for the service and then go for the second half of the meeting. And then, you know what, I just thought, I need to stop doing that. I just need to stop and pay attention to what I'm doing and be present. And then to be at the service and to meet with the family beforehand and do my best in ringing, and then give myself some time afterwards for processing. So I don't know if that fits into what exactly we're saying, but I think I definitely, I know I felt better in general, but certainly something of a sense of greater connection at an important time. So.
Nice.
Yeah, they lived without me, so.
I'll share. At the end, when you gave us a homework assignment, said in addition to the 2 chapters, maybe, and you mentioned the name Mary Oliver. Maybe you want to read a Mary Oliver poem. And I was immediately reminded that a former pastor here, Keith Roberts, his favorite poet, he told me, was Mary Oliver. Okay, and I see when I looked her up, she spent some time, a year at Bucknell, and she's been all over the Midwest, I guess, and to Provincetown, so forth and so on. But her poetry, mostly about nature and mostly about what we're talking about, slowing down, taking time to pay attention, observe, and just see how things are connected and really slow down before you can solve the complexities of, the environment globally. Maybe we should just focus on the world around us. Mark's walks around Doylestown in the woods and seeing the red fox and the native plants over by Guadalupe and so forth. And I found this is the only Mary Oliver poem that I read. And I think it's representative of much of her work because it's called The Summer Day. And it's basically about, it reminded me a little bit of, I don't know if you remember William Blake's The Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry or symmetry. What the hammer, she sees a grasshopper. Mary Oliver sees a grasshopper. Can I read this?
Of course, go ahead, yeah.
The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who's eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who's gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Just like the way she uses nature as a springboard to get into the sacred and the holiness all around us, or a grasshopper to being at one with the Godhead. So, yeah, I think I'll be reading more of her.
Thanks for sharing that. Anybody on Zoom would like to share? Go ahead, Larry. Yeah.
So paying attention, that's actually one of my daily rituals. And I'll just mention something a friend of mine said to me years ago. She said, if you're distracted when you're walking along, just look around and say 2 words like starling tree, starling tree, starling tree, until you see bright moss, bright moss, bright moss. And you can say these things out loud if you don't mind looking like an idiot, but you can say them to yourself. And the other thing I've really actually been paying attention to a lot this week was children in little rectangles. So I started work with a couple of Head Start classes remotely, which is not easy to do. So, attention as much as I can to what I see and hear of them, through this electronic medium is a challenge, but important. It makes you just realize how much we can get from a distance, and of course, how much we miss.
Thank you. Yeah, Patricia, go ahead.
You mean Peggy?
Oh, Peggy, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Peggy.
Well, I just happened to be thinking about the assignment and also happened to notice the death of Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist monk who was from Vietnam. And anytime I see Vietnam, that catches my eye just because our daughter is from Vietnam. But anyway, so I was trying to read some of his poetry, and long story short, I came upon a website called, let me see what it's called, unity.org. And there was a message on it that I won't read the whole thing, but it's pretty short, and I thought it was really interesting. It's called Notice What You Notice. And it's about paying attention and how what you pay attention to changes the way you filter the world in your everyday life. And if you pay attention to the negative, you feel negative. If you pay attention to the positive, you feel positive, etc. And so that's all I wanted to contribute.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing all of those thoughts and reflections. What I'd like to do, we have 2 chapters. There's a lot in those chapters, but they do blend together nicely. There's a nice transition from chapters 2 to 3. So I'll provide just a Cliff Notes summary. Again, I promised a synopsis for those of you that maybe couldn't read carefully or couldn't read the text at all and just want to be able to participate or know what's coming. So I've also put, those of you who are here, just a brief outline of the main topics and themes from each of the chapters on the board behind me. But in chapter 2, Pope Francis begins with just a brief reflection on something that with the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, was a major point of emphasis, and that is faith and reason and science and religion. And he talks about how there's need for fruitful dialogue, and we need to seek wisdom in all places, not just within our own spiritual religious tradition, but with what wisdom science can offer. He's very clear that wisdom is not all encompassing, as the technocratic paradigm from chapter 3 would suggest, right? To think that we can get all of our answers from science alone, but he doesn't want to create any polarities between the two, right? Oftentimes we hear about conflict between science and religion, or kind of faith and reason, even public and private life and what belongs where. And Pope Francis doesn't want to, he wants there to be dialogue, and he thinks there can be fruitful dialogue between science and religion. And he talks about then the creation account that suggests a human life, and this is from paragraph 66, grounded in the relationship between God, neighbor, and the earth. And that third part, the earth, is a really important one, because oftentimes we can focus so much on an anthropocentric account, a human-centered account that sees it's all us and God. And he's making the claim that the earth is that all-important medium in which we come to know and experience God, right? As God's creation, it's how God has chosen to reveal God's self to us. And so we can't separate our understanding of, and this is maybe an obvious point for everybody in this room who's interested in environmental justice and concern, but we can't separate the earth from that, from the God-human interaction. All three of them belong together. Goes on, though, to say that sin ruptures those relationships, and that's where we get accounts of dominion that are problematic. Any account of dominion, and there's a number of ways Christians have approached this topic, dominion models, the idea that God gives us dominion over all things, and in a more beneficial account, we're seen as priests of creation, and so we enact that on behalf of God. In the more harmful accounts, it becomes ours to do with what we will, right? Like it's in the severe forms, it's all going to burn up in the end, and so so what? And obviously, that's not Pope Francis's vision, and he wants to move beyond that dominion model to a stewardship or a kinship model. He's really looking at the idea of being wise stewards of creation and an understanding of our relationship within creation. So that's what we mean by the stewardship combined with the kinship model. And then he talks about the important distinction between nature and creation. And he says they're not exactly the same thing, right? Nature on its own doesn't provide meaning or purpose, according to Pope Francis. Rather, creation, if we understand nature as creation, that necessarily entails a kind of relationality. After all, creation entails a creator, entails created beings. Who don't owe existence to themselves, but depend on God as their source and end. And so it's able to provide an account of matter that doesn't denigrate matter or say it's not as good as supernatural reality, but he wants us to view the way in which the created order is in fact ordered as its end in God. And he is going to provide the explicitly Christian account of creation in chapter 2. And again, that is not to make this a discussion limited to Christians. He's very clear that this is something that we should seek conversation and dialogue with all spiritual traditions, right? But he's clear on his central claims and axioms that this is how a Christian account of the world is able to confront the myth of unlimited progress and dominion as human mastery over and against nature. And so his emphasis then is on the common good, right? Any accounting, and this is his critique of modern Western society, and really the stories that we adopt that say what we hold as a central truth is development at all costs and unlimited growth and a kind of belief in limitless growth in a finite world, something that the law of entropy just doesn't allow for when you think about it. Finite resources, matter's never created or destroyed. The second law of entropy states that the universe is moving toward disorder. Now, yes, there's anti-entropic processes like our bodies, right, that can fight that, but this is what some have called an entropy acceleration, right? Unlimited growth is nothing other than a belief in a limitless planet, which is just an impossibility, right? So he's calling us to work for the common good and wanting to dispel that myth of progress, which he sees, I would say, as really a dominant myth in Western society. Chapter 3, I won't go through that right now, but he expands on that technocratic paradigm, and he really sees technology and modern technology specifically as that which enables ever greater mastery and control, right, on an unprecedented scale. And so that's coming obviously out of the Industrial Revolution and the ability to realize a perceived limitless growth, limitless development due to not just machines, but the way that we apply this paradigm to all things. We talked a little bit last week about education, how really this paradigm begins to touch all spheres of life in the economic realm, the field of education, field of environment. And so he's calling us to move beyond mastery, again, to work for the care of all creation. So we'll introduce chapter 3 and give a little bit more detail to that. But with those themes, before I get to some of the specific questions I have, just wondering, want to hear your thoughts, what stood out to you? If we can begin with chapter 2 and some of those themes, or if you noticed or recognized something that I didn't point out, by all means, draw us to that. And just would love to hear some of your thoughts and questions that you formed as you read.
Before we get to that, could I recommend a book? Because the way you phrased it there, I just looked up the author and I've already forgotten his first name. It's either Gerard or Gerald Schroeder.
Okay.
The Science of God. It is not about caring for the environment, right? But it's about the interface of science and religion. He's an American who is educated all the way through his PhD at MIT, but he has spent his entire academic life teaching in Jerusalem in a university there. And he just does, and it's not, you know, a quick read. It's pretty dry, but I just remember how he approached creation in scientific terms and how the way the Bible goes in a certain order is how it happened, how scientists view the same thing, with starting with the Big Bang and all this other kind of stuff. And the numbers, every like epic or whatever, the days in Genesis 1 is then cut in half in terms of time the next day. It's so orderly, and it's just really got some interesting things in it. So I'm just, for anyone who might be interested, to take a look at that book. It's The Science of God by Schroeder.
A little puzzled by the, he says in here, synthesis between faith and reason. And it occurs to me that science, I mean, it's God's science, creator of heaven and earth and all that's within. So the science, to the extent it exists, we can figure it out. The workings of the universe, that's God. That's the way he set things up. There's a definition, I don't know where it comes from, but one I personally like, that defines God as the purpose and workings of the universe. Which, you know, the purpose, you know, that to me is intelligent design. I mean, there was some purpose behind recycling. And in science, the workings of the universe is, you know, it's like if an engineer builds something, he's got a purpose of building it. And then the workings of that, whatever he builds, that machine. What I'm trying to say is that is inherent when the intelligent designer put it all together. So I don't see a conflict really between the two.
Mm-hmm.
But you know where I think you get into some real issues that are difficult is, to what extent did the intelligent designer set things up in science so that to some extent they're on autopilot? By which I mean, and I personally believe there are things on autopilot. I mean, plate tectonics, for example, you know, which we only figured out like, I don't know, within my lifetime, 50, 60 years ago. We didn't have any idea about that with it, but that explains volcanoes and earthquakes, and, you know, tsunamis and things like that. That's the workings of the universe. Now, Didn't God set that up as a part of the scheme? He did. But then you get into the question, well, if you pray really fervently and you get 8 billion people to pray that there won't be any more tsunamis or earthquakes, I don't know, can you interfere with the workings of the universe?
Right.
I guess that what I'm getting at is that we have to recognize that we are a part of the workings of the universe. And to the extent that there's problems coming, we need to save us from ourselves. Carl Sagan said that in one of his programs. No one's going to come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. You know, the science is there, and it's inevitably moving along according to its own rules that the creator created in the first place. I don't know the creator's inclined just to change that science because we're not adept enough to, not destroy ourselves in the process using those rules that he set up. So I tend to view it as coming back on us. And even as a part of the creator's intent, he gave us brains, so, and I don't see that conflict between science and religion as perhaps other people do, but I do think inherent in that is a responsibility on us, not to seek outside help to save things, but to get on about the business of being rational and use the science as we understand it, ineptly or otherwise, to solve our problem.
That makes perfect sense to me. God created the scientists. If it's up to, I think, us to nurture our young scientists to continue seeking answers to all the questions. Look how long it's taken us to learn what we know today compared to, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, a million years ago. It takes time. I mean, there's an infinite number of questions about the universe that still have to be resolved or answered. And yeah, I don't know if God's going to intervene, like he doesn't intervene when some little 6-year-old comes down with a disease or is shot, I don't know, road rage. He doesn't. God doesn't intervene. But it's up to us to use those gifts of science, intelligence, and so forth, to maybe find ways to save the environment, to save the globe. Might take time. I'm sure it's so complex. It's going to take some complicated solutions too to resolve the complicated problems. It's taken, I don't know, maybe we've speeded it up in the last 100 years, pollution and stuff. I don't know how long it's going to take to resolve the problems.
I don't know either. I guess just the final thought is that, we really need an action plan. That's up to us. That's kind of what I'm saying. And a lot of this book is justifying the religious view of the world, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But that doesn't, it's not going to get us away from an action plan when it comes to the environment. And that's us. I mean, those of us in the room and the rest of the world and whatnot. I don't know how fair it is to expect religion or God to give us an action plan, or how words from however long ago in the Old Testament, New Testament, or elsewhere constitute an action plan for today.
So the way I read it is, I think you're absolutely right that we have to find an action plan, and nobody's going to come and save us. We're not, no matter how much we pray, there's not going to be some kind of intervention, right? That we can pray for and expect to save us. But just as we say, we have the capability or the technology, whatever, to me, the message kind of screaming out at me is The reason why we need to look to the Bible or to the teachings, Christian teachings, is because we've been missing the compassion part. And it's, you know, whether you have deniers or whether you have scientists who want to solve it, until the compassion element is pervasive throughout all of humanity, nothing's going to solve it. And until everybody sees it collectively as a problem, sees it as something that we have lost this connection with creation and with each other, and that we care about each other and we find that compassion. And it's not just those of us sitting in this room who are choosing to study this, but every person, the leaders, the decision makers, the scientists. Without the compassion, we'll never get there. I think, and I felt like that's what, you know, this was saying to me. So
I think you're right, and I think that there's another side to this. It's not just a religious approach. The religious approach and ethics, all of that ties in, as you were saying, the compassion or kindness ties in, but we do know some ways to mitigate already the problems caused by global warming. In Europe, there's in one of the countries where there's, I don't know, I think it's the Netherlands, but it might be in Russia, see, but to block the sea out from a harbor, they've put in massive gates across a bay. They are so large, it takes two engine locomotives running on a track to pull them open and shut. There are different ways to approach the climate crisis. And if we don't follow the religious teachings, the philosophy, as well as the science, and I'm talking really about, this is mostly applied science, not basic science, but if we don't look at what's the right way to mitigate it, and maybe mitigate it in the word, the right way is to allow the planet and solar system, the universe, whatever, to be more able to do what it was designed to do, if you will. We can build a big dike around Miami Beach in Miami and spend billions or maybe trillions to try to save that coastline of the city. But we're not doing anything about the problem that's causing the rise in the ocean. So that we want to try to fix it so we can plan A, fix it so we can continue our lifestyle and take care of the problem by pushing it back. Or do we want to fix it by changing our lifestyle in ways that are more in harmony with God's creation? And I think that's the difference between creation, which is a said and done thing, and study of nature, I think, as you pointed out, which you can study and get laws, figure out what the laws are. We got to have the willingness, and it's just not the deniers to get on board. We want to be sure they're going to get on board, and we're also on board with the right way to attack the problem and not just try to mitigate it so we can continue our lifestyle success.
And then, yeah, an interesting question, because I think we're kind of getting without, I don't want to jump to kind of some big theological discussion about the activity of God and the activity of creatures that could lead us on a whole nother tangent. But I wonder if you could answer succinctly, why not just continue as we are? What guides the kind of presupposition that we should act so as to preserve humanity? What is it? What is the kind of why not just, well, if we know entropy is real and we're going to respect the laws of nature and it's all heading that direction and there's no hope outside, what gives us the ability in the present to say we should act in such a way to preserve humanity? And is it all humanity, or?
I think, and not just for me, but I think that we're going to kill ourselves, actually. I'm not scared of that right now. I think it's a little far off in the future, but that's what we're really doing. You disturb the food chain somewhere in the middle or up and down. All the things below the food chain is larger than animals or fish ate. You don't have any more, and then they die, and then the fishing, the seafood goes away. It doesn't take much.
Isn't the answer to your question though exactly what you said, compassion? I mean, if we've got a core value in Christianity, I think it's compassion. Probably, I can't think of another core value. Not belief, but core value, compassion. And, you know, that's really what I think this encyclical is asking for. And I wonder if we're all that effective in connecting that compassion to Christianity and saying, you know, listen, Christians, there are a lot of us out there. That's it. The bottom line is compassion, period. Don't muddle your mind up with all kinds of other complicated belief systems. Compassion is the message. So, I mean, I don't know. I think that's the answer.
Right, compassion for all of creation, compassion for each other.
Right.
Yeah, right. I
And
mean, because to answer a question about why, I mean, you know, because we know what the science is predicting, right, in terms of what's gonna happen. And frankly, initially, those of us in, you know, industrialized countries will probably be fine, but you know, it's all of the millions and billions of people in many other parts of the world that will suffer because they will be the hardest hit, they won't have resources, and then we're gonna have mass migration and mass death and.
But I don't even know that the goal is preservation of humanity, and maybe it is, but if it's getting back to compassion and it's respect for all of God's creatures is really why, for me, I'm driven for climate change, because I have no idea what will happen 100 or 200 years to humanity. There could be another thing that happens. Somebody could decide to do a nuclear bomb, and that would end it regardless of that. But even on page 58, he says, you know, the winner takes all model completely is at odds. In this model are the ideals of harmony, justice, fraternity, and peace as proposed by Jesus. So it is exactly that compassion, that respect for all of God's creatures is why we do it. Full stop, actually, I think.
Christo, go ahead. I see your hand there.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Yeah, I was going to make a similar comment than the last one. So I think the why is that we are decidedly a different part of creation intended by God to have a different intention here. I think that in the end, we have a moral obligation towards one another as much as we have towards nature. I also don't know if preservation of humanity should be a goal for us, but as long as we are here, we have a moral obligation to live up to God's intention, God's dream for us. There must be in my simple mind, scientifically, I'm thinking there must be a reason why we are so much different than all the other animals on this planet. You know, what do we make of that, and what's the weight that's put on our shoulders to be then caretakers in some way of nature, but also of one another? Don't we have a moral obligation to not let everything go to crap?
I have to actually just add that the whole notion that human beings dominated nature only came across in the 1700s. And before then, nature dominated us, and we were always fearful of what nature did because we couldn't explain it. And then once we started to learn science, we thought domination started to happen. And so perhaps it is recognized. I was thinking about it today after finishing one of the chapters. It wouldn't be so bad for us to realize that ants do things and cockroaches will live on way past any of us, and they will continue through anything. So do we really know so much better? than other parts, even though we've been given minds and we've given creative thought, we really don't understand the value of other beings on this planet. And perhaps their contributions are far more significant and far more important than ours. And we're just messing it up.
There's actually a book that I was reading called Sapiens. Have any other of you read it? The history of, humankind. And it talks about the evolution of Homo sapiens. And actually our dominion, it wasn't just the 1700s. It goes way back. And that as the Homo sapiens started to leave the Afro-Asian continent, that was the wave of the largest mass extinctions on the earth, because as Homo sapiens, sort of conquered other areas, there were, I think the book says that like supposedly we killed off half the species on the planet just because, our foraging and hunter gathering and whatever, all of that. So we've been
It was a
We-
philosophy in the 1700s,
Yeah.
but you're right, we've been messing it up for a long time. Yeah.
But there's a little bit of that. That's just part of what I think the early comments that Greg made. I mean, let's face it, we had nothing to do with the dinosaurs, and they're all gone, right? So let's not be too harsh on ourselves either as human beings. Yes, we are part of nature, and we have a role to play. It's imperative that we do think about that role. But I was just reminded on the previous comment too, the Bible, the language, the Hebrew language makes a lot about chaos and specifically people trying to express their position against nature, because we think we have it under control. We think we have some control over nature right now. They clearly knew they didn't. And you see that reflected in the Hebrew literature a lot about how, they talk about, you think about Jonah and the whale and the water and the chaos and the danger of that. And so a different paradigm that we may find some wisdom in if we revisit.
Peggy, go ahead. I see your hand there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this may be simplistic, but I've always learned that the Native American culture very much was aware of environment and sustaining the environment and replenishing the environment and living that way and honoring the dead, animals that they ate, etc. And I know that we're not an agricultural society, and there's a lot of stuff. All I'm saying is, if we look back in history, it isn't just always about man ruining every environment that he lives in. I think you have to be mindful of how you approach the environment.
Thanks, Peggy. It's not simplistic at all. It's really perceptive. Thanks.
One thing that the Pope does reference is Leviticus. What's the author's name?
It's okay, you're not Catholic.
And
It's not a requirement.
and I mean, that is a model for behavior based on compassion, because it's the day of rest. That's compassion for yourself, for the field, for the animals, everything else. But then there were the Jubilee years, and debts were forgiven. If the people who were given that law, that's in that one little part of Leviticus, he references it here, the Pope in 71. If people had actually followed that, and he starts off talking about the flood because God was so disgusted with how everything was turning out. But if people really did that forgiveness on the Jubilee year for buying land and this, it would actually even be an equalization of money and power. But of course, no one ever followed that. But there was a model. There was a model way, way back at the very beginning of this people that God chose on how we're supposed to share by always leaving some for those who don't have enough, and forgiving debts and planning it out so that there's an, an equity among people, and some don't accumulate too much. So there is a model, even way back in the Old Testament.
When we talk about a moral obligation, as I think Christo did, to protect the planet and nature and be compassionate, I think the point is that it's also a very practical obligation. I mean, to do the opposite isn't going to benefit us. So compassion is morally correct, but it's also very practical. And it may be the only practical, that gets us to the practicality of what has to be done. More than, as much as the moral obligation.
I think those words, till and keep, to till the soil and keep it's, a lot of that is bound up in those two words. Compassion. Usually what works best is what works best for all of us, not just for the few. And we have a hard time wanting to make things better for all of us. I think that's a big thing.
I think, we're talking about how God doesn't intervene, and how God has left a lot of activity up to us. And I think that alone speaks to the nature of God too. I mean, think of the person of Jesus as the exemplar of what, God in the flesh. God has no need for us. That's what the Christian tradition holds. It's not like creation is God's battery or what God needs to sustain God's self. It's an utter gift in that regard. And what some have pointed to is the only true gift, right? Like that can't be reciprocated. There's no giving back to God what God has given to us. And we have a God who has chosen to be the God who chooses not to act without the creatures. God could act without the creatures, right? It's not that God can't, but when God's acting through the prophets and God is saying, do this, I think everything I've heard people say is pointing to the exemplar of what Christian faith is. It's that it's not about you, right? And that's exactly what the Babel enterprise was. So as a transition to chapter 3, we don't need to move to chapter 3, but I just want to kind of frame it and then let our discussion continue. When we think about the two prime models of technology, I believe I mentioned these last week in Genesis, you have the ark and the tower, and both of those are examples of human making, right? It's technate, and it's in accord with some account of reality. One is idolatry, it's Babel, we can make ourselves great, we can do something great. And we see all sorts of Babel building enterprises today. I think that's the transition that happened coming out of the medieval era was Francis Bacon saying knowledge is power, right? And it's not knowledge is service and compassion. If we want to control nature, we have to dive deep into nature and get to know what it is materially and efficiently, and that's it. And then we can exert control over it and we can know it better. And he was right. I mean, the proof is in modern society, right? We do have more control over nature, but as we've also learned, there's limits to that power, and we don't really have full control. And so in the other side of that, then the ark, it's a construction, but it's a construction that's in obedience, that says, and it doesn't even really make sense, but this is literally the preservation of the human race, of the animals, and that's God used that ark as a vehicle of grace. And so an interesting question is, are we building a tower or are we building arks? Which are we on the side of? And we should be building towers. And the ark is not just for Noah and Noah's family, it's for everyone. And it's the choice of the community not to join. So I think, and then with John Locke, I think he really has done a lot of work in our understanding of what meaning and purpose is in terms of control of nature. And a very brief summary of his view would be, yeah, well, the Native Americans didn't do anything to it, so they didn't own it, right? Whoever transforms it is the one who now is actually making it something beneficial. It's not until humans transform something that it becomes valuable or that we can say there's ownership. And that's precisely why they failed in their dominion, according to a Lockean model. And that's kind of how we view, in my vision, right? It's how we view a lot of things today, right? It's only something when we lay claim to it, when we kind of possess and own it. And that technocratic paradigm is precisely that. We seek ever more control, and we say, hey, there's a disaster. What do? We need more technology, right? And so we're using as a solution the same thing that's causing this problem, and it's precisely not community, but it's something that we try to universalize and make for all times and places. So that's, in my reading of Pope Francis, that's what he's calling us to. I think the most powerful passage to me is when he says, and let me quote this directly so I don't mess it up. We cannot heal ecosystems if we don't first heal human relationship. And that to me is powerful, right? Like, stop pretending that you can fix the world. You don't know what the world is because you've bypassed it, and you've bypassed one another. And so start to form better relationships, start to seek the betterment of somebody else rather than yourself, and pay attention for a moment. And then you'll start to see, hey, this is, okay, there's a reason that yeah, there's the practical import of this, where we are happier when we do that. And we do have different kind of emotive reactions. But as long as it's us defining that, I think this is a great definition of sin. It's forgetting that we're created. It's forgetting the fact that we do have a givenness to our being that is not something we can define. And so all of these attempts to define who we are, right? What does it mean to be an American? That's really problematic today. What does it mean to be an American evangelical, right? Really problematic to wrestle with that tension. And a lot of people are like, I don't know if I can call myself this anymore, because it's starting to become morphed into an idolatry disguised as a spiritual Christianity. And it's just not a witness to Jesus, who can certainly get down from the cross, but is the one who decides to show what it means to love. And so I'm going to stop talking now. And that's the introduction, I think, to chapter 3, which is creativity versus power, right? When we think of industrialized society and technology, community, just add that to the mix. And I'm not going to ask any specific questions yet, just because I think conversation's been going really well. So I'm curious just to hear how you respond now, and I'd like you to think through and include any chapter 3 content as well.
Just at the end of chapter 2, one sentence, a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings.
Which paragraph was that, Casey?
91.
91, okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
It's kind of summarizing what everybody was saying, I think.
Yeah, that's a great reference.
I think I had a theological question that I'm not going to ask to derail the group on, but if afterwards anybody has insights to offer, I'd appreciate it. In section 80, and maybe it's because it's from the catechism, and maybe that's where I'm having trouble, but it says, creating a world in need of development, God in some way sought to limit himself in such a way that many of the things we think of as evils, dangers, or sources of suffering are in reality part of the pains of childbirth, which he uses to draw us into the act of cooperation with the Creator.
Can you give us the paragraph?
I'm sorry, 80, on page 56. And I have no idea what that means. And so we don't need to get into the rest of the evening on that, but it really threw me for a loop because it was in the same paragraph that it was talking about the cooperation that you just outlined at the beginning of what you were saying. So it really confused me. If anybody has insights, I appreciate it.
Yeah, they're really, and I think you're right. It does, to properly answer, it would take a good amount of time. And I'm not, I don't know if I'm interpreting this correctly. I think he would be referencing there's creation ex nihilo, which is creation from nothing, kind of the initial creation of all things. This would be creation continua, which is the fact that God continues to create. And it's not, and God is creating through this type of development. And what I don't know based on what he's saying is how he's accounting for the role of, when he talks about, the fact that we're sinful creatures and how sin has altered that pattern of development. That's what I'm not sure about, but he's referencing the fact that the world is not some static operation, but is in a process of God is continuing to create and bringing the world to something that will eventually reach completion, but is not there yet. That's and I'll leave it at that, but that would be my brief. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that's my brief interpretation.
Point for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we really co-creators? I don't know. I feel like I feel uncomfortable with that idea that we as human beings are co-create. I mean, I guess if you think of creating not necessarily just a good thing, we changing things and the way that we influence, not always being a good thing. But when I think about God and creating something, he created something good until he created humans. Anyway, I'm struggling with the idea of being co-creator with God or continuing that process of creation with God.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Christo. I interpreted the part about the act of cooperation with the creator and not necessarily meaning co-creation, but more of this was God's intention, right? And he asked us and he entrusted us and he told us to keep and kill, and that was the command. And so that's how we cooperate with his intent for how we would care for creation.
Yeah, and if I misspoke, I would completely agree. I'm not saying at all that we create in any way that's equivalent with God, that is even by way of equivocation, it's an impossibility. Any creation is an act of subcreation, not a creation of God in that way. So our activity is in accord with some account of reality, I think, and that's either something that we're defining ourselves, or it's in accord with the world God has already given to us, and that's the only way in which we create any. So I completely agree, and please don't hear me as saying at all that I think we create in any way on the same level or plane as God creates. Well, thank you for that correction if that was coming across. Peggy, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that really on page 1 of the book, something that struck me is that St. Francis of Assisi refers to our sisterhood with the earth. I think of that as a different perception than our dominion over the earth, our even stewardship, which sounds like a benevolent dominion, but sisterhood, partnership is different. And that's something that struck me on page 1.
Paragraph 1. Yeah.
So with that discussion of kind of our act of making, I won't call it creation, but our act of making, how are you interpreting what Pope Francis views as that technocratic paradigm, right? As kind of an all-encompassing vision that is guiding our acts of making. Are you in agreement with his approach that it's, I think he's seeing it as a harmful one, right? You need to move beyond the paradigm, not to become a Luddite or destroy technology, but to kind of make it a secondary good that is serving a primary good of service of one another and the human community and the common good. Is that how you're reading him, and are you in agreement with that idea?
I've been struck earlier, so I don't recognize everybody. Somebody made a reference to the Old Testament rules around paying off debt and the Sabbath rules for both agriculture and commerce, and I was struck with this idea of it keeps on it's acknowledging two things. It's acknowledging that we will keep going out of balance and that we then have to do something very actively to restore the balance. So let alone we'll go off balance. Without any guidance, we won't come back into balance. And I think some of this, what I'm reading around technology is, it could be a means, or it should be a means to help restore that balance. And we need to keep checking ourselves, because our nature is going to be out of balance and not to stay in balance. And then surely we have to identify when technology becomes only a means to take us out of balance. And I don't know if we still do that. I don't know if we if we remove things. Anyway, just my thoughts on that.
I feel like we've lost the sensitivity to that, the technology just keeps plowing ahead, and there's no thought given to trying to maintain balance. One thing that I highlighted here, and I was remembering, I think last week, Bill, you were saying that some of the words that Pope Francis chose to use were really kind of striking, and this word here really struck me on paragraph 89 at the end there, where it says, here I would reiterate that God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification, if I'm saying that right, of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. That word disfigurement really struck me. But then I thought, that's so interesting, because I think we're saying God wants us to be so closely joined to the world that we would feel the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. But I would hypothesize that the vast majority of us barely give it two thoughts, when another, one of the, God's creations and God's creatures are become extinct. And so that would be lovely if we were so tightly joined. And I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about here, is that we've lost that connection.
That's a good point.
Pope Francis reiterates that there's no sense of taking care of the environment until we take care of society, in that, we must have compassion for our fellow man and woman. We really have to show love for our fellow human beings before we can solve problems with the soil, the air, and water. In 2 paragraphs from there, paragraph 91 at the very end of the paragraph, concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. And I think he's saying, as I read these, that has to really come first, is this love for your neighbor. And yeah, this technocratic paradigm, it's a yin yang, good and evil kind of thing. Unless it's in check, we'll wind up like HAL 9000 in the movie Space Odyssey, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where technology takes over, to the regret of man. I don't know. I keep wondering about God from the get-go. He must have seen this coming. He's omniscient, right? All knowing, all powerful. He's just shaking his head, only vague, but he doesn't want to intervene. And so free will, I have to sometimes question, I guess it would be too easy if he made us like puppets, just playing out his dream part.
He wants us to want to, the compassion for
Yeah,
environment.
that's what
I have trouble though with looking at it as a project flow chart, when you have to do task 1, task B, task C. That we have to all all have universal love for our neighbor, and then we can start the other. We can have that love and compassion right now, and it seems to me they're not bound by a timeline. I don't think we have to get everybody in the world loving their neighbor as themselves, or your neighbor may be any other creature on the planet, before we start trying to apply a technological solution.
Right, but you have to have agreement to apply the technological solution, and right now we don't have world leaders that are on the same page.
Well, we can tell them what's going to happen.
Well, and actually, I was thinking about that this week, because last week we talked about what could we do? And you brought up gun control, which I completely can resonate with. And we talked about our politicians and needing to speak out to our politicians. And I was talking about gun control with a friend of mine on a hike. And he was reminding me that at the federal level is not where we intervene, because in our Constitution, we give those rights to the states. And so we have so much more power as an individual than we exercise by speaking out at the community level and speaking out at the state level, because the federal government is frankly not designed to intervene at those kinds of things. And so it really is incumbent upon us to act at the community level, to be compassionate here, to set those examples. It unfortunately doesn't jive with the rapidification that we talked about last week, where things will be lost, but we do have to act. We do have to be compassionate.
I think we have to act at both levels, though, I mean, because there are things like gun control that they can do at the federal level, and, you know, like the
Yeah.
banning of the assault weapons happened at the federal level, right? So,
Well, it's very limited though from the, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but it's actually very limited because it crosses state lines.
Right.
And so it's I got angry when he said that. I was like, oh my gosh, you're just justifying guns. But then I was like, no, actually, if I'm going to make a difference, I have to work in the system that I've got, and I need to put my energies in a place that I can be effective. So of course,
Yeah.
we need to speak out, but it was just reminding me
And
of
that's
that.
where the state will apply funds, if
Mhm.
you can convince them. But the federal government provides funds to all the states
For certain
based
things.
on
Mhm.
the population. That's why we have a census every 10 years. So it will get the attention of the federal government automatically
Mhm.
by funding things. If we change what we want our legislators here to do, whether the county, the city, and make sure that's in their program and their policies that they're saying they want to abide by or implement when we go to the polls to vote also.
Mhm.
But that does get the federal government involved. And of course, there are certain laws that the federal government does have jurisdiction over.
It actually just made me hopeful.
Yeah.
That our individual actions at community level can build and can make a difference, so we can start somewhere. That was really the point of that. When we did this.
Yeah, Greta Thunberg really made it.
Tying that back
Perfect
into it.
example.
Absolutely.
I don't want to discourage any activism. The one chart that made me sit up and pay attention to say our system is utterly broken is that there was a study out of Princeton of all the major issues that people care about, and you plot it on a graph. And so I'm a very visual person, and it says, you know, on one axis was like the percentage of the population that supports it, and then on the y-axis was the percentage likelihood that something would pass, right? That it would become law or whatever. And in the ideal world, you would see a perfect 45-degree line, right? So if 0% of people support, then there's a 0 chance that would pass. And if it's 50%, it would be 50% and 100% and 100%, right? Guess what that line is? Straight flat. That means they don't give two hoots what anybody wants. Wow.
And that's why you have to act at a local level, right? I mean, like,
Well,
it
but-
actually ties back to that beautifully.
Well, no, but that's actually at the local level as well. That's everywhere. That's not just federal. That's not just federal. That's how corrupted our system is today.
And that's where I think, because we're, you know, state, federal, but also when we think of the church's role in that, an interesting way to also think about, so God intervenes, you know, I think God does intervene through the work of the Spirit. I think that's the, you know, to kind of draw us and orient perception in a way that says, you have all these fears, right? Like the fear that somebody might come and kill you, so you stockpile guns. And there's something about that that is fundamental to why there's a culture, right? And so scripture in some ways in the church can provide I've heard one theologian put it this way: it's not that we provide a must not, right? You must not do this, but it's that all powerful you need not, right? Because perfect love casts out fear, and this spirit of love is capable, right, through the working of the spirit to say, hey, wait a minute, why do I feel the need, and what am I fearful of? And is my primary fear a fear of, kind of, I need to preserve myself and I'm fearful of what happens if I can't. And the gospel is very clear that that's not what orients activity, right? It's a fear of God that says I serve, and as I serve, I have a freedom there that doesn't chain me to my need for control and self-preservation. Sorry, Crystal, I just saw your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really to earlier comment about, why would God create something like the earth, if he knew the outcome? And I was like, so I started thinking about that, and I'm like, isn't that exactly if God, well, let me put it this way. I just thought about it, so pardon me if I'm stumbling here a little bit, but isn't it very human-like to start something knowing exactly what we want to accomplish, right? That's what we do. When we build something, we know we're going to build a house. We know we're going to, and I'm like, maybe it's extremely godlike of God to create a earth, a universe, whatever we want to call this, not knowing the outcome of it. That he's gonna put a little bit of science in it. He's got a little bit of that, and he's got a little bit of that, and he's gonna put a whole lot of mystery in there. And it's like, let's shake it up and see what's gonna come out. And in the meantime, I'm gonna keep engaging my creation. I'm gonna keep engaging and keep being part of it. But there's not an end. There's not a perfectness that's in creation, because God, if God was going to create that would have been really against any. That wouldn't have made sense, right? Why would He have done that? It's almost like we would have done that, but God does something different.
So I'm just going to support what you just said. I remember in Sunday school decades ago, learning about free will for the first time. And I went home that afternoon and I played with my Lego set and I created a whole little Lego town. And I just sat there and looked at it sitting there. And I thought, gosh, this would be so much fun if one of my little Lego people would actually just do something, because I wouldn't have designed it to do it. It would have actually, done something here that I could then see how this plays out. And that was my learning of what free will was, and perhaps why God would do that. And it was, you just summarized beautifully that little lesson I had that day from Sunday school about what is free will. Just supporting.
And then we think about creation. We've heard, or we know that we are just part of, energy and matter that just keeps being reformed into different ways, right? So there's something also very beautiful in that sense that we have been here forever and we will be here forever. We will be in different forms. And in some ways, God is like letting us do the Lego work and keep working on it, keep tinkering on it. I don't know. I should stop saying stuff.
Maybe someone in this room or on Zoom, Christo or anyone, Einstein, there was a famous quote from Einstein that said, God does not play dice with the nature of the universe, or something to that effect. I forget what the exact wording was, but something about God is not a craps shooter when it comes to, I guess, destiny and nature and that sort of thing.
No, and I don't want to suggest that that's it. I'm just struck with the idea that there is something God-like in the way that creation is running its course, is going about its business, that I don't think if a human being have done it, we would have done it differently. We would have had a different plan for it. And And maybe God's not rolling a dice, but maybe that's what free will is. That's that unique capability that God has created, and that spark that he put into each human being to be something, to really be something. And then back to earlier comment that Craig was making, it really comes into fulfillment in our relationships, right? I mean, here we are, 2,000 years after Christ, how many billion years after the Big Bang, and we as a group of people that's in a relationship in some ways are having this amazing discussion about our place, our universe, where we belong. And that in itself is something to kind of like just say amen to,
Mark, were you going to comment on the? Okay, I thought you were going to comment on the Einstein quote. Sorry.
One thing we haven't mentioned, and there's a sentence in paragraph 109, it's almost stark. Finance overwhelms the real economy. This is when he's talking about the technocratic paradigm. And we talked about free will and compassion, all these things that we aspire to in the nature of God and all that. But sometimes when a sentence like that is just finance overwhelms the real economy, it just seems we can only do so much. There's so much power in money. I mean, even if we're talking about elected officials, how much money they raise and how much TV time they get and everything. Sometimes it just feels like it overwhelms us because we may want to do what God would want us to do, but it can get very discouraging.
One of the questions I was going to ask is even how with technology as a paradigm, kind of not only governing work, but also rest and leisure. And when we think about the role of Sabbath, that's something that Pope Francis also mentions in chapter 3, is he points to Sabbath rest as a really crucial part of the creation account. What do you pick up there as significant about Sabbath and how that is understood within the technocratic paradigm, how we understand rest and leisure, those kinds of things?
Well, technology has taken over the Sabbath. It's taken over rest and leisure as well as the workaday world. I mean, what do people do when they have free time? My teenage grandchildren close the door in their room. They look at their phones, communicating with their teenage friends. Others will use high-speed, just racing boats or whatever to have fun out on the lake. Or, I mean, technology plays an important part in work and play. In the Sabbath, the seventh day, whatever that is for you, you can enjoy, an electric blanket. This one. I don't know if that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, how do we, yeah, exactly. How do we define rest in kind of within this system of efficiency and mechanization? It seems like rest becomes merely a recharging of the battery so we can do more work, right? Like, give the workers the maximum time they need off to be as productive as they can be so they're more productive on their return. And so it tends to devalue work and leisure, right? Leisure is simply recharging the batteries. It's not that preserve of freedom and kind of what brings unity to all things. And work then is just a kind of, well, you do what you got to do and be as productive as you can. And as soon as a machine can do it more efficiently, right? Like Pope Francis mentions that as well, that our task, our goal should not be the elimination of jobs, but actually the valuation of work and including more people in production in society and helping them become a part of it. And we just are so specialized that we don't even really know how to engage, it seems to me. I don't know if that's how you're reading it, but that's kind of the basis of the question.
Quality over quantity when it comes to creating jobs. And again, with the technology in leisure time, instead of slowing down and taking nature walks and communing with nature and noticing all around us, we spend probably too much time in front of the television set or at the movie theater. I mean, TV is a good thing and the cinema is a good thing. But again, it's all about moderation, I think, and not letting technology dominate your life.
You know, this is the last paragraph is titled "The Human Roots of Ecological Crisis," and that is a bit belaboring the obvious. But it's also true that over time, we've become the dominant species. Not just in numbers, but in our capability. In fact, I think this era is called geologically, is called the Anthropocene. Yeah, the human era, because we dominate the earth.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing is, to me at least, that some of the skills that we so admired 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, tribal societies where the good hunter maybe had 2 or 3 wives because he was capable and he could provide for more. And so from those benefits and skills came rewards. And of course, we carried that forward. And at a time when, as it says here, that it talks about the problems being based on the lie that there's an infinite supply of the earth's goods. Everybody wants more, which means those of us who are just more fortunate, more capable, will take more as if it's our right, because that's in our nature, that's the way we develop. And those who are less capable, the least of these, will simply get less. And yet that philosophy that served us well when we were competing with saber-toothed tigers and mammoths and things like that to become the dominant key species is now very destructive when our numbers have gotten so huge. That not only doesn't benefit our species, but it won't benefit the environment we live in. I don't know where this is going, except to say we never adjusted. We didn't have to adjust. And maybe a part of nature's plan is that there's an adjustment coming. It is cruel, but there'll be a new equilibrium at some point.
I think COVID's part of that adjustment.
It could well be. You know, that's a good point, because we're so condensed, so we live together.
Yeah.
Pandemics happen when you transmit disease.
And we are encroaching on wildlife, habitats, and so, diseases are jumping from animals to humans. Yeah, absolutely.
And the only other point I would make is that we've all grown up in a capitalistic system. To some extent, we accept it or believe in it. Wasn't necessarily ordained by God or something that had to develop. It's not necessarily a good system in our present circumstances. And I think we have to recognize that. Nor is it really a system that, I think if we could go to Jesus and say, well, what do you think about a capitalistic system? And here's the way it works. And if you have more, you get more, and you take more, and you live a life of luxury and ease, and you don't have to care about other people. And he was a guy who had nothing and wanted nothing and lived simply. Probably would not have found that a good model for human existence, certainly not one that is consistent with his ideas of compassion. And yet those systems don't seem to adjust. If they're there, they're there. And today with 8 billion people, much of the world is still the capitalistic system. To those who have advantages come wealth, and those that don't, you get left by the wayside.
Well, as an economic system, capitalism as it developed, tended to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. Especially here in the United States, maybe the UK, Germany, several places. But it relies on growth. You have to have growth because as people rise up in the ladder, they need a piece of the pie. And if you don't have, you have a finite planet, you have, we've overcome the limitations on agriculture with fertilizers and things like that. Plant seeds. But ultimately, the Earth's finite, the amount of water that's here is what's always been here, pretty much, and it isn't going to change. So that at some point, the system has to be revised, whether it's through regulation or some other legal process, or it will fail. And you can see it, the failure is starting when we see capitalists are now making money by buying somebody else's business. We want to privatize the post office if we're on the side of that, because they want to get the money and have the, there's nothing new. There's not a new thing that you can go out and grow out of the ground or invent that everybody moves in their homes and we don't have the space and all to do it with. So at some point, if you don't have a way to continually grow, you end up an automaker that makes electric cars is going to supplant the automakers that make gasoline-powered cars. And privatizing the post office or privatizing Medicare, Social Security is just, there's a, in the mix of all the dollars flowing around in the economic model of the country, the GDP, all that the people that are trying to use the system find that they have to get this stream of money from somewhere else, and so I can have a profitable business. If I can privatize Social Security, there's a pile of money coming in that I can do something with and provide a service and take a profit. What we're doing is just trading who's got the money, and we can't grow anymore, and that's all that's left. And I think that's a sign of demise. We have to do something about
Thanks, Bill.
outgrowing our systems, ability to cope with society.
That's a very interesting point. Thanks. Yeah, we are at time. I'm sorry, I wish we could continue. It's been a rich discussion, no pun intended, but really appreciate all your, just everything that we got to share today. I do wish we had more time. Next week is chapter 4 and 5, integral ecology. He's really getting to the kind of how he's understanding the stewardship and kinship approach and the interconnectedness of all things. The last week will be chapter 6, and we'll have some time also in our 4th week to not just spend on chapter 6, but to discuss, one of the focal points of this series has been to consider what it might mean for Doylestown, right? To move beyond this, as much as it's good to have that global approach, what we're learning here is that, the relationships we have here in our community, in our particular place, is really important. And so we'd like us to continue to think through that as we prepare for both weeks 3 and 4. So I hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thanks again for being here so much. Thanks to those of you on Zoom, and hope you can all join us next week. As always, if you have any questions or things you'd want me to focus on or add to this kind of list at the beginning, feel free to send that my way this week. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.